Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks to the CFMA, and thanks to Matt Blaisdell, who helped set this all up and understood the need for this consulting and acted fast to make it happen. Appreciate everyone joining us this morning, and my name is Ryan Robinson. For those of you who may have been at the last presentation or were not at the last presentation that I gave for the CFMA, I'm the Chief Service Officer at Mainstay Technologies. We're an IT services and information security services firm. We work with a lot of construction companies, a number of whom are part of the CFMA. And just given the nature of the webinar format, I wanted to say at the beginning that, you know, I love to do questions and answers as we go. Typically, if I'm doing like an in-person seminar, in this case, I think it'd be better to simply type in your questions, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. So you can type in your questions into the Q&A box, and then at the very end, we'll go through all those questions. And I'd encourage you to write them down as we go, rather than trying to just wait to the end to ask them. Also, another thing I'd love to do is take a few minutes at the end as well to kind of crowdsource some tips and tricks. You know, we've all been doing this now for a couple weeks, doing a lot of remote work. I'm sure a lot of people in your company are doing that and learning things that have worked, learning what has not worked, and it would be great to get everyone's feedback on that. So not just putting questions in, but would love to hear also additional recommendations that you'd have for others. I don't have to share your name or anything, so don't feel like you're going to get called out publicly for anything. But would love to hear what you guys have developed for tips and tricks yourselves. Also, don't stress about taking notes here. We can send notes, detailed notes to anyone who requests, not just the PowerPoint, but send detailed notes as well. You'll see the email on your screen there. Corey Hoyt is our communications manager. Excuse me, and if you just email choyt@mstech.com, you can feel free to, or he'll be able to send you those notes, so no problem there. My philosophy here is I want to get through a lot of information. I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can, but kind of overload you potentially with information so that you can dive in deeper later. So I grew up in New England, so I can talk fast when I need to. Hopefully I won't talk too fast. And actually, my main concern today is just that I don't cough too much. You know, coughing is like one of those things you cannot do in public now. And I find that when I am doing these webinars, I am coughing a bunch just because I'm inhaling too much air and not keeping my mouth closed enough. So note that I have not been coughing other than when I'm doing these webinars. So I don't think I've got it. I hope and trust, but and don't worry, you can't catch it over a microphone anyway. But my apologies in advance if I cough a bunch. So our goal today here is, you can see that this presentation is called the Remote Workforce Playbook for Financial Managers. Our goal is to give you, excuse me, a playbook that you can take. I'm gonna get my water more ready here. To give you a playbook that you can basically say, all right, I know exactly what it's gonna take for us to work remotely fully. I'm gonna give you some tips and tricks, give you some specifics around that. We're gonna talk about both the technology side, we're going to talk about security, and we're going to talk about culture. So the playbook is going to cover those three categories. So let's dive in. The situation. So the coronavirus has changed the market dramatically, right? Just in a matter of weeks. I mean, it's unbelievable to think about where we all were just a month ago, right? Like my last presentation at the CFMA was only, I think, what, 2 months ago? And think about how much the world has changed since then. I mean, in New Hampshire in particular, we basically had to move to remote work almost overnight. We got the notification on Sunday, right, that schools were closing. And so many people who had, you know, did office work and were able to immediately work from home did so. Obviously, construction crews may have continued to keep going and all of that, but we had to make this change very, very quickly. And then last week, of course, the stay-at-home order has taken that a further step in requiring all non-essential businesses to shut down. Now, the good news in this is that the market has been, and technology has been moving towards enabling a remote workforce for years. You know, with the proliferation of mobile devices and cloud-hosted infrastructure and applications and increased bandwidth, I mean, where would we be, right, if this had happened in 1980. I mean, it would be a very, very different situation that we'd be facing. The challenge, though, is that, in particular for the construction industry, and construction industry is going to get hit hard by this. And, construction is not a one-size-fits-all thing. Not every construction company focuses on the same kind of work. You have some companies that do a lot of commercial, some do a lot of residential, some that work on public works projects and so on. And this is going to hit different companies in different ways, but all of us are going to have to adapt, no matter what industry you're in. But if you're in construction in particular, if you're in an industry that may get hit in this, we're going to all have to adapt quickly. The situation that we find ourselves in really gives us no choice but to adapt fast. Most of the time in the business world, business changes develop over months and sometimes even years. And now we are in a position where we've had to make significant technology changes, or work from home changes, that kind of thing, almost overnight. And then we're going to have to pivot very quickly as well, because it's not like this has been something it's been developing over months, but it's not something that most people were prepared for. So we are going to have to, you think back to when the meteor hit, right? Millennia ago, it's like you either go extinct or you adapt, and you adapt very fast. And that's what the situation that we're all finding ourselves in. It's also worth noting, I think one thing that I have heard over the past couple weeks is a kind of hope that, pretty soon we're going to be back to normal. The restrictions are going to be lifted, and we'll be able to kind of take it as we'll be able to go back to where we were previously. However, I would argue that I don't think that that's going to happen. Now, not that I think that we're going to be in this quarantine state forever, but rather there are changes that have happened in our culture. There are changes that have happened in the way that we view germs. There are changes in the way that we are utilizing technology. There are changes in the workflows of our businesses that have all taken place over the last few weeks, and we are very unlikely to kind of just go back to the way things were. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about today in this playbook is really, I think, a long-term playbook. It's not just a short-term, this is the next 2 weeks, but we're going to be looking at changes that really are now going to be expected by the individuals on our teams, are going to be expected by our clients. And this move to remote work in particular may not be permanent, in terms of a fully remote work, but it's going to be a lot more common coming out on the other side of this. And so if you've kind of been thinking, well, I don't need to make too many of these drastic changes because it's all going to go back. No, I think that we are going to see long-term effects for this. Some people think that the handshake, for instance, may never come back in Western civilization after this. I don't know if that's true or not, but from a technology analogy part, it is very unlikely that we're ever going to go back to the expectation of the companies that expect that people are in the office 100% of the time. So what we want to do today is really give you this playbook for enabling a remote workforce. And it's going to consist of 3 categories. First, proper technology, having the proper infrastructure, remote ready endpoints, proper remote connectivity, peripheral devices, et cetera, proper communication tools. Then we're going to talk about security layers and workflow. So this is a time where it's easy to think that this is when we sort of throw security out the window because we're having to make all these changes very quickly. But this is actually the time when security is most critical. So we're going to talk about both that on the technology side and the workflow side. And then cultural intentionality. This is going to change our company's business cultures, and we have to get in front of that. We can't just assume that somehow that culture is going to develop just wonderfully on its own. We're going to have to get ahead of that now that we don't have the same sort of control over the physical environments of our teams and have the same level of physical integration and interaction. So let's start with this first one, proper technology. Excuse me, hoping that frequent watering will prevent the coughing. All right, so proper technology. So when you think about your on-site infrastructure at your business, typically you're going to think that you got a few key categories. You've got your server environment where everything's hosted. you've got your applications and your files and so on. You have the other services that are being provided by your server. And then you have your ability to remotely connect. So we're going to talk through all three of those categories. So let's start with servers. So when you move to remote, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of you here on this webinar are, made a very quick pivot that Sunday night. You're like, okay, people are going to be staying at home tomorrow. Let's make sure everyone has appropriate VPN or remote access. And probably your infrastructure largely looks the same as it did a few weeks ago. You've just ramped up your amount of remote access. What I want to encourage you is to think about a couple other options today, okay? So the first option to consider is taking that local infrastructure that you have and moving it to cloud-hosted infrastructure, sometimes called infrastructure as a service. This is basically where you take, your physical server is best actually to think of as a host. And I know a lot of finance managers are folks who oversee IT, so hopefully I'm not talking over anyone's head here. But the server that is often called a server is actually a physical box, and it's really best to call it a host versus a server. And the reason is, the reason that's the case is because a physical host can have multiple what are called virtual servers or VMs, virtual machines. They're called different names. So that server, that physical box that you have, that host, is really nothing more than a bare metal hunk of metal that software, those server operating systems can live on. So if that's the case, then rather than having those physical boxes that you have to remotely connect to your physical office, what about taking those virtual servers, those virtual software layers that live on that box, moving those to cloud-hosted infrastructure? And that basically just means removing them from your physical host and putting them in a data center. When people talk about the term cloud, that's all the cloud really is. The cloud is just, instead of your physical devices, you have your software living on physical devices that live in data centers that are all lashed together in these redundant environments with tons of security, tons of business continuity, and then you're just accessing them over the internet. So there's two ways to do this. You can use either private cloud hosted infrastructure or public cloud hosted infrastructure. Private cloud hosted infrastructure is more like, you've probably heard of rack space. This is where you basically rent out space in an individual data center, and you function the same way that you would in your local environment. Maybe IT remotes into that private cloud. Private clouds tend to be a little bit more expensive, and there's less of a use case for private clouds more and more all the time. And so we're big fans of the public cloud. The public cloud is utilizing not just individual data centers, but really utilizing services that are provided by these big three players, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. So either Microsoft's Azure platform, Amazon Web Services, or AWS, and the Google Cloud. All that means is that those data centers are owned by Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. They're geo-redundant, meaning they have data centers all over the world. And so even if a whole data center goes down, those services or that hosting will be replicated in other servers in other parts of the country or other parts of the globe. And so that's a huge advantage that you have in public cloud versus private cloud. Also, you get the advantage of just the economies of scale. And so the public cloud can often be less expensive. So this is a great way of kind of replicating your current local infrastructure, but moving it all to the cloud. So that's option one. Option two is something that sometimes people don't really think of, which is going serverless altogether. Now, if you think, okay, what does a server do? A server typically does a few things. One is it provides hosting of applications, it provides hosting of files, and it provides individual services. In fact, that's why a server has its name. Server, all it is just a big computer, really, that has a different kind of operating system that allows it to provide individual services to individual computers. So if you can take each of those three things and then move those into cloud-hosted services, cloud-hosted file management and hosting, cloud-hosted application management, and so on, then you are able to essentially remove the need to have servers at all. So taking it from the top, if we start with applications, let's say you have a locally hosted QuickBooks instance and you have QuickBooks on an individual computer or on your server. Well, you can move that to QuickBooks Online. QuickBooks Online doesn't have the same functionality as local QuickBooks, but depending on the sophistication of your organization and how you're doing accounts payable and accounts receivable and all of those things, QuickBooks Online may be a great option for you. It's fairly inexpensive, 50 bucks or so per license per month, and can eliminate your need to utilize that hosting on a local computer or on your server. Some people, by the way, like QuickBooks Online better. A few years ago, you'd hear a lot of negative things, but over time, people are liking it more and more. They're making better and better improvements to it as well. So if you haven't looked at QuickBooks Online, or you just heard negative things about it a few years ago, it may be worth another look. You can also, let's say that your organization uses Sage. There's the excuse me, there's the whole Sage Business Cloud suite. So if you're using Sage 50, you can use Sage 50 Cloud, and all of these just remove that requirement to have those applications hosted in your local environment. You can also do the same thing with file hosting. So your local server probably has a file server. Well, you can remove the need for that by utilizing Microsoft OneDrive or Dropbox for Business or Citrix ShareFile solution. And for Microsoft OneDrive in particular, many of you probably already have the licensing for that. If you're using Office 365 now, you probably already have Microsoft OneDrive licensing. And if you need additional space or additional functionality, you can always move up the chain on the licensing, but that can be often a very, very inexpensive way to do it. And it makes it so that wherever you have an internet, you can access your files. Then the trickier part becomes kind of the individual services that your server provides. So one example would be like account management and Active Directory services, they're called, that are done on a local domain controller. Well, there are cloud-hosted services for that. So for instance, Microsoft has something called Azure AD, which is a cloud version of Active Directory. You can also do a lot of the security management that your server provides utilizing something called Mobile Device Management, or MDM solutions that are out there. So even from a security perspective, you can replicate significantly what your server is providing to you. And so if you are able to sort of offload all of those things that your server provides, you can go into serverless environment, which means that you're not having to pay that 10, 15, 20 grand, whatever it ends up being, to replace your server your server host, I should say, every 5 years. You're not having to pay for all the server licensing costs, which can be expensive. And you're just making a lower maintenance environment, an accessible anywhere environment. So it's really worth considering looking at a serverless option. So if IT has not talked to you about that, that's something that still IT companies sometimes feel uncomfortable with. Just because many IT guys sort of cut their teeth in standing up servers, and so it's still very foreign to a lot of IT people, but it's really a great option and can save you a ton of money. And I think in this particular time period, we're going to need to all be tightening our belts and be much more conservative financially to get through this crisis. And so serverless option can really make a lot of sense, especially if, let's say that your server host right now is 5 years old and it was already going to be coming up for replacement. This is a great opportunity to look at that option. Now, for some of you though, you may not have that option, and maybe you just bought that server host last year, and so you've already invested in that local environment, and so it just makes sense for you to keep going. So if so, and you've probably already made the shift to utilizing VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network, which essentially allows you to kind of remotely access network resources the same way you would if you were in the office. It just creates a secure encrypted tunnel for all that traffic to be sent back and forth from your home office or some small remote office. So you can use VPN. You can also use what's called remote desktop services, or RDS. A service, a very common service for that is called LogMeIn, or ConnectWise Screen Connect. These are services where you essentially will remote into a computer that's sitting at the office and then access network resources that way. I'll talk a little bit more about this later when we talk about security more in depth, but the one thing to note about remote access, secure remote access, if you're going to maintain a local server environment, is make sure that you have multi-factor authentication on those remote access tools. So if right now you're able to log into your server and you don't have to put in some sort of secondary code or secondary factor of authentication, then you really want to work with your IT team to get that in place, because that is putting your whole environment in a more high risk sensitive situation. So really recommend that you layer around two-factor authentication on any of those remote access services. Okay, so that's the servers. Let's talk about the endpoints. So endpoints are basically just any device that enables you to access either network resources, your files, applications, whatever. So these devices are, laptops, desktop machines, tablets, smartphones. And really, in a word, this means that we all just need to move to laptops. And some of you may have been ahead of that curve and have been buying laptops for years. Others have tried to stick with the cost savings of desktop computers and still may have a number of those. But as you start replacing your fleet now, it's going to be more and more important to get laptops to enable that remote workforce. Now, when you buy laptops, a few things to consider. One, make sure they're business class machines. So that means that they should not be bought down at Staples or Best Buy. You want to have business class machines that have solid chassis, proper ports, that you don't have adware and bloatware, which is often if you've, let's say you've worked with IT and you felt like the computers you were getting through IT were more expensive than ones you see down at Best Buy. Well, part of the reason that is because they don't have this adware or bloatware that makes it so that they can cut costs down by putting that adware on. But those are big security vulnerabilities, and you really don't want those if you're using them for business purposes. You should also include some spare machines. Remember, not just to buy, a one-to-one laptop for each individual, but the industry standard is 3 to 5% of your fleet should be backup machines. So if you have 100 machines, you should have 3 or 5 spares at any given time, so that if someone goes down, they can be, brought a new machine or shipped a new machine, or what have you. Sometimes if you're if you have a higher risk tolerance, that maybe you only have 1 or 2, but it's really important to think about having those spare machines. Now, I say all this, but the irony is that this is the hardest time to get laptops. Currently demand is really high and the supply chains are weak. So desperate times call for desperate measures. So if you're in a situation where you say, I'd love to get a laptop, but can't get a hold of them, I want to give you a few potential options. First of all is you can bring your desktop home. Now you're going to need to make sure that if you do that, that you've got a long enough Ethernet cable, because most of those desktop machines don't have internal wireless. And so you're going to have to bring an Ethernet cable to plug into your router. And you just need to realize that if you have a home office upstairs and your router's down in the basement, you may have to get a 100-foot Ethernet cable to make sure that it comfortably is able to connect. So when you bring that home, just don't assume that you can just sort of bring it home, plug it into the wall. You're going to have to get a long Ethernet cable. You can also get a external wireless card, but those are really hard to get right now. So make sure you work with IT to get a long cable. Now you can, if you are desperate, you can go down to Staples or Best Buy and pick up a non-business class machine at a retail store. The only thing that I would really caution you on, other than the adware and bloatware and those kinds of reasons not to do it, is just make sure that you get the appropriate video card, especially for construction companies. You may have employees that are working with CAD and other higher rendering software, and a lot of times if you don't get the right the right video card, then you're not going to be able to. Those applications won't display properly, and sometimes they'll crash. So you want to make sure that when you go down, you know exactly what video card is required, what level of video card is required by your applications. And so you can either go to the vendor's website to check on those video card specification requirements, or you can work with IT and have them do it. Also, make sure that you've got the right warranty length and coverage. Those machines, those non-business class machines, are notorious for dying quickly and having issues that need to be fixed. And so you really want to make sure that you've got pro support for your warranty, that you have plenty of length, at least 3 years at minimum, and that the return policy also is generous. Some companies' return policies are really it's a little bit like buying a new car. As soon as you buy it, the value goes down and they won't let you return it except for very specific situations. And so just be really careful what that return policy is, so you know that going into it. Last option is you can use a home computer, of course, but I want to really discourage anyone from using their home computers. Home computers are notorious for having, malware running behind them because they don't have the appropriate centrally managed antivirus solution. There's all kinds of security challenges that can come from that. Home computers often will get used by multiple people in the family, and so there's also risks that are associated with that. So if you do use a home computer, if you have to, what I'd really strongly recommend is make sure that you inform IT about that, and or if any of your individual users need to do that, make sure IT is aware of that so that IT can put on central managed antivirus, potentially web and URL filtering tools, have monitoring on those devices, at least in the interim until you can get them a business class machine that's owned by the company. And also, you want to encourage users to not, and not even encourage, that's not the right way of saying it. You want to ensure, force through policies and training that users are not allowing non-employees to use those machines. So, those machines should not be used by their teenage sons and their spouses and so on, because you never know when someone's going to download that free, screensaver or something that's going to have something on it that's going to compromise your data or your client's data. All right, now you get the server worked out, you got the right endpoints. There still may be additional peripheral devices that you're going to need, and I want to talk about a few of the key ones. First is dual monitors. Now, in a business environment, this is sort of a no-brainer now. Most people realize that there's so much advantage in having double or even triple or quadruple monitors. I know right now I'm looking at 4 monitors right now, and I wouldn't have it any other way at this point. Dual monitors have a dramatic increase in efficiency. I mean, you can get a 10 to 49%. There was a Microsoft study done a while ago that showed that was a 10 to 49% efficiency increase when you used a dual monitor, depending on how much time you're spending on your computer every day, how many applications that you were using at any given time. And it's funny, speaking of Corey Hoyt, the gentleman who you can email to get the notes for this, he was telling me that Stay Work Play, if those of you who are familiar with that organization, it's a New Hampshire-based organization. Stay Work Play on their Twitter feed and their LinkedIn has this thing called hashtag Stay Home Work and Play, where people are sending in pictures of their home workspaces. And what you see if you look at those pictures is that people have very comfortable workspaces often. They're pretty backgrounds and all of that. But oftentimes it's literally just someone's laptop without any dual monitors, without any external keyboards and mice. There's no actual home setup. It looks like people are just assuming this is a very temporary situation. So really you want to encourage your team, especially, if you've got engineers in your team or finance folks, other finance folks who are in front of their computer a ton, really have them bring home their dual monitors from the office or get them. I mean, it's $150, and for that kind of efficiency increase, when you think about what the average salary is, that's like pennies on the dollar. So I really encourage you to do that. Also, get your team external keyboards and mice. I mean, that's another big efficiency improver, and especially if the keyboard that's on your laptop tends to be very finicky, oftentimes, especially if you don't have as good of a laptop. Sometimes even if you have a good laptop, sometimes your hand can hit the trackpad and send the mouse all over the place, and you can click into things you didn't mean to click into, and it just wastes a lot of time. It's very frustrating. So utilize those keyboards, those external keyboards and mouse. They also have, or mice. They also have ergonomic keyboards that are really that I use, that allow your hands to kind of sit in a more natural way. And so that's also another nice thing you can do for your team. And then the last thing I want to mention is docking stations. So if you look at your screen, you look at the bottom right hand of that picture on your screen right now, underneath the computer monitor, you'll see a little box with a silver front that looks like a kind of the size of a external hard drive or something like that. That's what a modern docking station looks like. They're not like the old trays that you'd put a laptop on and there was a fan underneath them and so on. These are, again, they cost about $150, and what they do is they give you a great ability to have a solid stay, work from home situation where you can have a docking station that will have a bunch of additional ports. So it'll have additional USB ports. It'll have additional display ports for VGA and HDMI and so on. So you can plug in those multiple monitors to that docking station. You can plug in printers and copiers and scanners and anything else you need, additional webcams. And then with one cord, plug the one cord from the docking station into your laptop. And that, if you get a newer docking station, that cord will often have power going to it as well. So with one cord, you can be up and running, have all of your peripheral devices ready to roll. So I encourage everyone to get desktop or docking stations as well. And that's going to make the whole process of having dual monitors and other peripheral devices more convenient. All right, let's talk about communication tools now. This is probably half the reason some of you are on this call, is just to learn more about these video conferencing tools and other communication tools. So I want to talk about 3 tools in particular. I talk about Teams, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and Google Hangouts and the G Suite communication suite. So first let's talk, so to set the stage for this, I mean, ultimately we are in a situation now where we don't get to physically see people, right, with the same frequency or at all. And so now these video tools that some organizations had used intermittently, maybe a little bit, maybe not at all, now people are using, exclusively and using a ton. And yet we haven't had an opportunity to sort of catch up on our training. It's not like we had all this time to prepare for this and get our teams individually ready for this and know how to utilize all these tools. So getting more training on the tools that we're using and knowing what tools we have in our tool belt, as it were, is really helpful. So when you're looking at video conferencing tools, you want to make sure that you're always working with a tool that can allow you to, one, have good internal meetings and collaboration and communication, but then also externally as well, so that you can use the same tool ideally for working with clients and outside vendors. So let's start with Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to talk about kind of pros and cons for each of these tools. So for the pros for Teams, first of all, a big pro is that you probably already are paying for licensing for it. Same way with that I mentioned with OneDrive, you're probably already paying for Teams and have it in some level or another. And if you're in the Microsoft ecosphere already, Teams provides a lot of collaboration options. So Teams can give you full instant messaging. It can give you screen sharing. It can give you video conferencing. It can give you phone conferencing. And it can actually be, Teams can be your whole phone system. In fact, it can take over as your phone system. There's something called a term called unified communications. Unified communications is kind of the dream of where virtual communication technologies have been trying to go for years, which is where you have all of your communication platforms living in the same integrated system. And that's, of the 3 that I'm going to mention, Teams is the only one that can provide that full unified communications platform. And part of the reason is because it can be, like I said, your phone system. As opposed to the other solutions I want to talk about today, and most of the other video conferencing tools out there, Teams is one of the only ones that can be utilized to take over your phone system. Now that can't happen overnight. Your phone system isn't going to be fully moved over tomorrow. If you reach out to IT and say, hey, I heard that Teams could be utilized as my phone system, can I turn that on tomorrow? No, you're going to have to think through how call trees are set up and replicate a lot of the things you have on your current phone system. But you can do, this is just an FYI, you can do kind of like a functional move to Teams right away if you needed to, where you basically set up, you transfer your phone number for your business, transfer it to Teams so it's redirected to Teams. And then you just get licensing, Teams licenses, for like the phone licenses, I should say, for the individuals in your company who need to answer the phones. And then those people can actually, through Teams, forward calls to individual cell phones. So quite literally overnight, you could set up Teams as your phone system if you needed to and be up and running. And then over time, implement a lot of the other functionality that your current phone system has. So that's a huge, huge pro with Teams. Also, Teams has a great, of course, being a Microsoft product, it integrates really well with other Microsoft products. So one example of that, for instance, is Outlook. If you're using Teams for your video conferencing, what you can do is with one click, when you create an Outlook calendar invite, you can literally click one button that says make a Teams meeting, and that will populate into the calendar invite the link to that Teams meeting, so someone can just literally click one link and be able to access that and be in the meeting. It'll give them a phone number. It'll give them all the information that they need in order to join via Teams. And you might think, well, what if I'm working with a client or a prospect or something like that that doesn't have this Teams licensing? Well, that's okay, because you can, even through a web browser, even if you don't have the licensing yourself, you can, or even if they don't have the licensing themselves, you can still invite them to a Teams meeting that you are hosting, and they can still join the same way that you can. They don't have all the same functionality necessarily, but they can still join in that, either as a video, phone, etc. Teams also does a great job of integrating with other apps. Like if you use Salesforce or MailChimp or SurveyMonkey, there's a lot of good integration there. And you can have plenty of people. It goes up to 250 people for video or audio. So you can have, an all staff meeting with Teams. You can, even if you wanted to do a webinar or broadcast an event to a lot of people, let's say that you have some annual get together where you bring all your clients and you talk to them about projects that you guys are doing or whatever it is. You can do what are called live events, Teams live events, that have up to 10,000 people and broadcast that. It's additional cost, but that is a possibility. Now, the cons of Teams really just are around the fact that you've got to buy additional licenses. And I mean, honestly, I'm not even sure that that's appropriate to call a con, because typically anything that you are buying in additional licenses, you're going to be replacing costs that you would have had with a different vendor. So if you utilize Teams for your phone system, well, it's going to replace your cost for your phone system. And really it's a pro in some ways, because Teams is going to be less expensive on the support and licensing side typically than it would be if you have a traditional phone system. Now, if you're using, one of the things that sometimes people ask was, they say, well, I have, a VoIP phone system now. Would I want, voice over IP? Would I want to use Teams instead? Well, if you have VoIP, first of all, that's great. If you have cloud-hosted VoIP, you can take your physical handsets and just bring them home and be up and running as long as they're connected to the internet. But I still think that Teams is worthwhile as a replacement for voice over IP, because one, it's less expensive. Two, it moves your organization towards utilizing what are called soft phones, which is basically where instead of using that physical handset on your desk, you're using a software application to dial the phone numbers and to transfer the calls and so on. And that creates a much more, a much better environment for a remote workforce, for one. But there's also cost savings involved in that as well, because you don't have to buy the handsets. The third is that it moves you towards using headsets, which that can often be one of the most sort of psychologically challenging parts of moving to soft phones or moving to unified communications platforms like Teams. But we find that it's a hard mental shift sometimes, but then one of the easiest actual practical shifts, because once someone uses a headset, they tend to love them. And there's a lot of good headsets out there. What's funny is, ironically, I'm not using one of the good headsets that I really like. In fact, one of the things I'd recommend for you to do is to make sure that when you move to these platforms, you get good headsets for your team. I have one that's not working right now, unfortunately. I've got a new one that's on order, but I've been coughing during this, for instance, which is frustrating to hear if you're on the other side. But a lot of good headsets you can, as soon as you move the mic up, it'll mute it automatically. And there's all kinds of great features that different headsets have. So get a good headset, and if you do that, it's still well worth moving away from those voice over IP systems. Okay, next let's talk about Zoom. Some pros of Zoom. So one of the big things with Zoom is that it's sort of not connected to any one of the other ecosystems. So it's not like with Microsoft or with Google, where their platforms are much better integrated when you're already in those ecospheres. Zoom can be used by anyone individually, any business. You can create an account and be up and running regardless of what ecosphere you're in. You don't have to have a Google Apps for Business tenant or a Microsoft tenant. You can just be up and ready to roll. Zoom has also been an industry leader for a long time. And if you were one of the lucky ones who had bought some Zoom stock back in December, you're probably a pretty happy person right now. Part of the reason that their quality is just that or part of the reason that they are popular is just the quality of what they do. They do a great job, for instance, of throttling bandwidth depending on what is coming into individual computers and changing the pixel levels so that you have fewer hang-ups and so on. Now, Murphy's Law is going to be into effect, and probably in like 5 minutes, my voice is going to go all robot and the video will lag. But generally speaking, Zoom does a great job with that. It's also better natively built for webinars. So, I mean, we're using Zoom today for this. We're big fans of Teams, but we're using this. Now, I think as a side note, Microsoft is doing a lot of research and development and a lot of improvements to Teams as we speak, and that's accelerated significantly even in the last few weeks. So even we're probably going to move to Teams for webinars, but again, this is just a tried and true solution. The cons for Zoom is that, one, it can get pretty expensive depending on how many people you have joining meetings. They have different cost plans, and after you move up a couple, it can be very expensive on a sort of per user license. Also, it can't replace your phone system, like I had mentioned that Teams can, and it just doesn't have the same integration with Microsoft products that most businesses, including construction businesses, are often running on. All right, last one to mention is the Google Hangouts and the communication options in G Suite. Google Hangouts is much closer to that unified communication structure that I mentioned Teams is, but it can't become your phone system, unfortunately. But what the pros of Google are is that if you're already in Google Apps, so if your business already runs, if you're like doing email using the Gmail client, and you already are using file sharing with Google Drive, and you're already in that environment, then this can be a great option to integrate really nicely. Also, Google just does a great job with having very friendly and intuitive platforms that are just easy to use. I mean, even their naming conventions are good. Like they have Google Hangouts is broken into 2 sections, for instance, Hangouts Meet and Hangouts Chat. And it's very logical. Hangouts Meet is for conferencing and meeting scheduling and all that, and Chat is for one-on-one. And so they just do a good job, better than Microsoft in my opinion, in naming things and marketing things effectively and making them highly user-friendly. Cons are, again, just that they can't replace your phone system. If you're not in the Google ecosphere already, it doesn't usually make a lot of sense, and I'd say most construction companies are not. But if you're in that minority, it's definitely worth looking at. All right, so let's say you get the proper technology. Well, it's not good enough to just have the proper technology. Second play in your playbook really needs to have solid security and secure workflows. So let's talk about some specifics here. We're in an interesting dynamic where we've got multiple security threats all converging at the exact same time. So, as I mentioned before, when we're navigating change, and my goodness, has this been a change for us all to navigate, organizations can become really fast and loose with security. And so that's one challenge, is that companies are just not thinking a lot about security right now. The second thing is that individual users, who are your number one security risk, even on your best day, even even when you're in the office, those users are even more likely to fall for social engineering tricks and phishing scams when they're also navigating change and in new environments and have different stressors and so on. And then also home networks that just don't have typically the same security layers as our business networks do. And so you throw all these in combination, and the hackers are not taking any time off in this. They recognize those things are all happening and are having a really open season right now. So we're seeing, we subscribe to a lot of security feeds that will talk about latest breaches that are happening to small and medium-sized businesses. And it is crazy how many more we have seen come up just in the last couple weeks. So this is an important time to actually focus more on security, not less. So let me give you some specific tips. So first of all, utilize multi-factor authentication. I referenced this before related to remote access. Multi-factor authentication basically just means that in order to get into something, you need to have a secondary form of authentication, not just something that you know, but something that you physically have, like a smartphone, or something that you physically are, like your thumbprint or retinal scan and so on. And so most services will provide a multi-factor authentication option. Most applications do as well. But a lot of times people just don't turn them on. They don't use them. They think they're going to be too much of a pain. But if you think about it, it's in order for someone to access one of your accounts, in order for them to do that, they would not only have to have your password, which they maybe could have cracked with a free password cracking tool that they grabbed on Google, but now they're going to have stolen your smartphone or, plucked out your eye and used it on a retinal scan. Like, the likelihood of them getting in if you use multi-factor authentication precipitously decreases. So the categories that I would encourage you to think about putting multi-factor authentication on is our bank accounts, whether those are business or personal. And if you have a bank that doesn't have a multi-factor authentication account or possibility, it's really worth considering changing banks, because who knows what that's indicative of behind the scenes. Email is another one. Some people will object and say, I look at email all the time, that's going to be such a pain. But modern authentication, modern two-factor authentication for email allows the secondary code, secondary form of authentication to essentially be cached, you could say, onto the device. So you're not having to constantly put in a secondary code of the email. The only time you'd have to is if you're using, if you're logging in through a web browser on someone else's computer or something. And also VPN, which I had mentioned before, VPN or any other remote access tools, you should be using multi-factor authentication for. And then, last category would just be any other, excuse me, any other places where sensitive data lives. So if you have, certain financial software or other places where you've got sensitive IP, then, put two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication on those as well. All right, staff training is another key. Your users are your number one risk. Even when they're in the office, it's not like IT can just set up enough walls for users to not leave open doors and windows in. So you really want to make sure that your users are having appropriate user security awareness training. That should be happening annually anyway, but I'd encourage all of you to think, if you are already using a user training service, for instance, that's being provided by someone else, then this is a great time to set that up. People are at home more, they're saving time, that they're not, driving from client sites and so on. This is a great opportunity to remind them and really refocus their attention. Also recommend that to make sure that user security training is part of your onboarding. When a staff member comes on board, they should have to take that automatically. They shouldn't wait until later on in the year or whatever. All right, secure email practices. This is key right now, is you want to encourage your staff to make sure that anytime that they are getting, fishy looking emails, 91% of all security breaches at least start with email. And so this is a critical time to talk to your team and say, hey, look out for these things and make sure that you're following these practices. And again, you can just cut and paste if you ask me for the notes or ask Corey for the notes later, you can just cut and paste these and send these in email at bare minimum to your staff. So first of all, remember and remind your team not to click on any links in emails. The link that they want to avoid most, it's counterintuitive, but is the unsubscribe link. That's the link that's most likely to be compromised. And you also want to, instead of clicking that unsubscribe button, you want to actually mark that message as spam in Outlook, which will then train your spam filter on what to look for. Also, don't click that download images button in Outlook. Any email that you are not sure of and you don't know is on your trusted senders list, make sure that you don't click that, because that will enable macros on that and potentially push the play button on malware that sits behind those emails. And then the last thing that's just so key in this day and age is to voice verify. So it used to be that you could, if you got an email that looked like it was from your boss, but you weren't sure, you could just open a new email, send an email to your boss saying, hey, I got an email that looked like it was from you. Is that actually from you? Problem is now you don't know if his or her account is actually compromised itself, because if it is, you're just going to get an email back that says, yeah, that was me. Please click that link or do what I asked you to do. Instead, you have to now voice verify. So if you get an email that you're not sure who it is from, you need to call them and say, hey, I got this email. Is this from you? Last one is just as you want to, consider establishing an information security program for your organization. One way to get about this is to say, look, it's very easy for organizations, and this is something I talked to the CFMA about when I spoke last time. So for those of you who were there, you might remember this point, that it's easy to think that IT is going to handle security. And many CEOs, CFOs, if someone asks them, how is security for your organization, they'll say some variation on the theme of, well, let me ask IT, or, oh, I just had a meeting with IT and things are looking great because they've got this technical solution and this technical solution and this technical solution in place, or these technical layers. But the reality is that your organization is only partially, typically only a third protected by technical security layers. You also have to have the proper administrative controls and the proper physical controls as well. And so when I say establish an information security program, what that means is you need to consider having you need to ensure that you have the right policies, the right procedures, the right user security training, the right compliance governance for whatever compliances you may be under, federal or state or vendor vendor required or whatever. And so all of those things are not going to be managed by IT, but they're going to be managed by an information security provider that's going to work with the organization on those organizational controls and really set the rules of the road for the organization, not related to just your technical security layers. A good information security program should include good technical security layers, but they are not the be all and end all. And so don't assume that in this moment when you're trying to be more secure, that is going to be primarily IT that does that, because that's just not in their purview. That's not fully in their skill set to be able to handle all those organizational elements. And one analogy that I love is like IT is responsible for the pipes, but your information security program should govern how that data is flowing in and out of those pipes, and what are the on-ramps and off-ramps for that data, if I'm mixing metaphors a little bit. All of that organizational workflow stuff is not going to be handled by IT. Okay. All right, last play in the playbook, or series of plays, I should say, is cultural intentionality. You know, our culture, our company culture has to be developed. Culture will be developed whether you want it to or not. And so the question is not whether it will, it's just how purposeful and intentional are you going to be about it. You know, at Mainstay, we've been thinking about culture for a long time, and as I'm sure all of you have as well, we're really fortunate. We have an incredible team. We won the best companies to work for the last couple of years. And, you know, I don't say that in any kind of braggadocious way, because so much of that is just, we have an incredible team of people that work well together and are all on the same mission and on the same page. But we have had to think a lot about what it's like to work at Mainstay, and how we manage our staff meetings and our meeting rhythms with our individual team members, and what our physical office is going to be like, and how we're going to encourage proper life-work balance. I mean, all of these things are part of having a great company culture. And this situation has not made that any easier, right? That's made this all the more difficult, because now we're not able to shape the physical environment of the place that our team works in. We're not able to have the same sort of, you know, in-person physical engagement. We're not able to have the same water cooler conversations. All of those things now we're having to think and make sure we're intentional about. So I want to give you, and this is another one where I would love to hear for any of you who have implemented some of these things, or have some tips and tricks for the rest of the people joining this webinar. I would love for you to post those in the comments box. Anything that's been working or not working that you've already experienced. Well, let me give you a couple examples of what we've been implementing, and what we've also seen work at the organizations that we've been working with for years that have been fully remote workforces. The first is to check in with your team, not just about their work product, but their work process. It's very easy to, you know, get in the mindset, especially previously before all this, to get in the mindset that what we hold our teams accountable for, what we connect with them about, is the end product of their work, you know, what they're delivering, the value they're delivering to the business or to the clients. But we have to be more intentional now to think about their process, and to help guide them in their work process, and hold them accountable for a positive, healthy work process. So for instance, you know, encourage your team to have dedicated workspaces in their homes. You know, I mentioned that stay at home, work and play, those pictures that we're seeing. A lot of what we're seeing on those is like people just setting their laptops on their, you know, on a desk or on their kitchen table or something, or not on a desk, I should say, you know, sitting there, putting their laptops on their laps, on their couch, those kinds of things. But that's really not typically very healthy. It's not good for your back. It's not good for your psyche. You want to think about having a separate workspace where you know, okay, I'm in work mode now. Okay, now I'm leaving that space and now I'm out of work mode. Also, encourage your team to implement daily routines as part of their work plan. You know, it's not just children that thrive on consistency and routines. All of us do. And when you get into a dynamic, you know, where you're working from home exclusively, even mostly, but especially exclusively, that, you know, life and work blend can just go totally haywire, and all of it can kind of bleed together. So really encourage your teams to say, all right, here's when I start work, here's when I end work, here's when I take lunch, here's when I connect with the kids downstairs, whatever. And talk about these kinds of things to your teams when you're having, you know, both one-on-one meetings, but also even if you've got reviews, annual reviews coming up, talk to them about their work process there as well. I'd also encourage everyone to consider, as part of this, what they're modeling for their teams. So, you know, I know for me, it's easy to jump on the computer at night, you know, after the kids go down and bust out some emails and so on. But the reality is that when I do that, I can often create a kind of culture for it in our company that's not actually quite healthy, because it may then set an expectation that, oh, well, then you need to respond to this at this time or whatever. And so what we want to model, I think, for our teams are proper work to home shifts and proper home to work shifts. So part of how you can do this is like encouraging your team and doing this yourself. Change clothes when you're starting work, you know, actually get into something. Maybe I'm the first person you've seen with a button-up shirt in the last few weeks. But, you know, it's important to get into a different mode, and our dress can really help us with that. It's part of the reason that, you know, in schools, often if schools that have uniforms, part of it, it's not just so that they can, you know, put people into conformity mode. Part of it is because that helps put on a different kind of mindset when you make that physical shift. Also, if you let's say you do have to email, you do have to jump on the laptop at 8 or 9 o'clock at night or whatever. Well, there's a delayed delivery button. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Outlook, you can hit a delayed delivery button where even if you're wanting to send that email at 8 p.m., you can actually have it delay the delivery till 8 a.m. the next day. And that just helps create much clearer lines of that work to home shift and that home to work shift for your teams. Second thing is increase one-on-one communication and all team engagements. You know, the need for communication is going to increase through this, not stay the same. And so instead of having like the, you know, quarterly all staff meeting, have a monthly all staff meeting. Do it over Microsoft Teams or Zoom or something like that, and just make them shorter potentially. Or if you've got weekly team meetings, you know, or monthly team meetings, turn those into weekly and just make them shorter, that kind of thing. And also just default to video. This has been a big thing for us at Mainstay, is that, you know, I know for me personally, I often don't want to send someone a video chat invite because it puts more pressure on them. You know, they actually have to, you know, not be wearing their pajamas or whatever. But in this whole situation, we need to be seeing human faces more. We need to be interacting in the most personal ways that we can. And so just start to create the culture, the assumption in your organization that you're going to have meetings with video. And you may even, you know, instead of sending someone a quick email, you may just call them on your video conferencing tool instead, and just start. And I would encourage you to let everyone know that that's an intentional move you're planning on making, so that people aren't surprised by it, but start treating that as a default. There's also a tool called Yammer, Y-A-M-M-E-R, a Microsoft tool that's kind of like a Facebook for business. You know, sometimes people don't want to connect with each other on social media in their life, in their sort of regular outside of work life, but Yammer provides a great way to kind of replicate the water cooler, you could say, but doing it in an online way. It's more casual, but still is possible in this remote setting. So how can Mainstay help with all of this? Well, we can be, you know, on the technology side, we talked about that as being the first play in your playbook. I mean, if your IT company or if your individual internal IT people are not talking to you about these kinds of options, if they're not talking to you about the different communication tools and how to use those tools better and training you on them and talking to you about these things, talking about how to move to serverless environment. I mean, if these are not the kinds of things you're being communicated with, or if they're just struggling because They're not ready for this. This is one of those moments where none of us can tolerate ineffectual IT. You know, our businesses are at stake. I have no doubt that sitting on this webinar right now are some finance officers who are very nervous about the jobs of their employees. There may be some of you who have already laid off staff or have begun furloughing staff, and you're stressed about how you're going to make it financially through this mess. And this is just one of the, you know, when things are well and everyone's making money and clients are rolling in, it's very easy to kind of put up with the ineffectual people within your organization, ineffectual service providers. This is not one of those times. We have to get more serious. You need to get your teams working effectively and efficiently and making the most of those salaries. And so if you're sensing that you've got ineffectual IT, and we can, you know, one of the things Mainstay does is we are an IT department for many organizations, and we can become, you know, we can enable your remote workforce, and we can be that great service provider to make sure your teams are effectively and efficiently working. Now, if on the same token, if you have internal IT staff, we can supplement what they do and support them in that. We have a separate division altogether that works just with internal IT departments. So we're not the kind of IT company that's very common in managed services for the IT company to almost want to take the jobs of the internal IT staff. But we have them work with a totally separate team, people with very dedicated workflows for IT departments. And so we can support them really effectively. We can also provide training or consulting on any of the things we talked about today and go deeper on all those things and get into real specifics with how all those work within your organization. We can provide managed information security services. So that managed information security program that I was talking about, that's something we can help on. We're not just a technology company, but we're a security company that can go into the organization, help you understand how, you know, be able to provide annual risk assessments for you and compliance governance and policy development, workflow development, all of those things. And then we can also, if let's say you're in a situation where you're not sure if you've got the right structure, whether it be on the IT staffing side, or if you're not sure you have the right structure in terms of the technology, we can come in and do individual IT assessments or security assessments and give you really comprehensive 360 view of where you stand, where your organization stands. And of course, call anytime. Always happy to chat about these things. And so feel free to reach out to me directly or reach out to the team, and we can connect with you individually. All right, so let's switch gears now and let's do some questions and answers. Would love to hear if there's any specific feedback that you have from things that you've seen done well. Now, I know that sometimes people are hesitant to put in questions like this. It's a little different than raising your hand in a seminar. And sometimes people just have, you know, they would rather ask the questions individually. And so that's okay if we don't have any questions, but would love, you know, to do any of that if anyone has anything. So let me check that out. All right, well, it looks like there's not any open questions. So I don't know whether that was just because I anticipated so effectively everyone's questions and got ahead of them, but or it may be just that you're waiting to ask them directly. So as I mentioned at the beginning, please feel free to reach out to Corey C. Hoyt at mstech.com. I'll put that back up on the screen here, and we'll be more than happy to send you very detailed notes on any of this, and would love to hear your feedback. And please provide your feedback, you know, frank feedback on if there's anything that you'd like to see done differently in these kinds of webinars, if there was additional information that you would have loved to hear talked about that wasn't, or just any other feedback would be more than appreciated. And you can also feel free to reach out to the CFMA directly as well. There are other kinds of topics that you'd like to hear us talk about. We could do a whole webinar just on video conferencing tools and talk about a bunch of different ones like, you know, Join.me and Adobe Connect and Cisco WebEx and those kinds of things. We can talk about, we could have one where we talk just about security or just about company cultural development. So if you have any other ideas for, you know, learning engagements through this, would love to hear that. You can reach out to Matt or the other folks at the CFMA directly. Well, I really hope that this was helpful and appreciate everyone's time today, and stay safe out there. And you know, at Mainstay, certainly our best to you as you navigate these challenging waters. This is going to be a challenging time for not just the construction industry, but really for our whole nation's economy. And so we're going to have to all stick together in this, help each other, and hopefully get out on the other side of this and be better, stronger, faster, more efficient, more effective organizations with even better positive company cultures. So wish that for all of you. And again, let's stay in touch. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.